Hello, Jonathan and Jillian. I wanted to go back and cover a little bit of ground with a map since I hadn't been able to really show you properly the liberation of Eastern Europe, 1989-1990. I wanted to show you that. Go ahead and recover a little land with another map on the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then move ahead with a couple of other things. So you'll remember that during the Cold War, the United States alliance, military alliance, was called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There was a communist equivalent. Our adversaries were the Warsaw Pact, and that was formed in the early 1950s by Joseph Stalin. These countries that you see here in orange were the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe. The German Democratic Republic, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And as you can see, those are the dates when they left communism for good behind. You will notice that Poland was the first, June of 1989. Now, you'll remember Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, had been put forward inside the Soviet Union, but it had influence all over the Warsaw Pact. But especially early, it had borne fruit in Poland. An independent labor union called Solidarity, Solidarność in Polish, had risen up, demanding the right to collectively bargain for workers apart from the communist labor union and the communist government. And Solidarity, although it was repressed, never went away, and it gained a lot of popular support in Poland. And as glasnost is going ahead in the Soviet Union, people who supported Solidarity say, why don't we have glasnost in Poland? And they began, demonstrating in the streets. The Polish Communist Party, though, was convinced that they were actually popular. They thought they could actually win a competitive election. And in June of 1989, the communist government of Poland agreed to have free and fair multi-party elections, which they thought they would win. They did not win. They lost. And a coalition of democratic parties that had sprung up out of nowhere formed the majority in parliament, coming June of 1989. Now, Poland was not 100% free yet, but the parliament began passing laws guaranteeing civil rights and civil liberties, guaranteeing the right for workers to organize their own trade unions and the like. The reason I say Poland wasn't free yet is because they were still a member of the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets were still insistent that Poland could not form its own foreign policy and that it could not leave behind the military alliance and so on, their alliance with the Soviet Union. So the military was still in communist hands. But a lot about Poland began to change in the direction of democracy. And it will have spillover effects. In Czechoslovakia, for example, people will see what the Polish people had done, how they had achieved something close to freedom from communism. And they would go in the streets demanding free and fair elections there. And they used the newest technology they could get their hands on, which were portable phones. I don't know if they were even cell phones yet, but they used it to organize huge marches, hundreds of thousands of people going into the main square, Wenceslas Square in Prague, to protest against the government, demand political freedoms. And the army was called out, but the army didn't want to fire on huge numbers of civilians who were peacefully protesting. So the army stood by as the protests grew and grew, until one night the protesters began pushing against the troops, telling them to, join them and not fight them. And the soldiers began throwing down their weapons and joining the crowd. And that happened in November 1989. and that is known as the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Václav Havel, a playwright who'd won the Nobel Prize, was the sort of leader of this Velvet Revolution. He would be elected their first democratic president. Alexander Dubček, a man who back in 1968 the Soviets had arrested and imprisoned for 20 years because he dared, as leader of communist Czechoslovakia, to even suggest the possibility of more freedom for the Czech people. He was brought to the palace on that night as the world marveled. But these things changing would inspire the crowds into the streets in East Berlin and other East German cities. And the communist government there was afraid they too would lose their hold on communism, and they thought about ways to try to defuse it. Well, one of the things the protesters were demanding was freedom of travel to the West. And so the communists thought they could give them freedom of travel to the West and still retain power, but they botched their announcement and instead implied that travel could begin immediately with no travel documents to the West. And when crowds began crowding around the exit points in Berlin to enter West Berlin to pass through the Berlin Wall at the checkpoints, the border guards didn't have any instructions, so they just raised the barricades and let people pour through. And then people began taking a sledgehammer to the wall when they realized the guards were leaving their posts and no one was going to shoot them. And that's the night the Berlin Wall came down in November of 1989. Bulgaria would see a very similar kind of people power revolution. It would collapse, its communist government collapse about a week later. You may notice that Hungary has a date in October 1990. Its communist government held on for almost another year. Ironically, this is because they were the most liberal communist government. They were the communist government that, for the longest, had a history of giving their people a bit more freedom and a bit more ability to travel to Austria, their neighbor to the west. So because they hadn't been as hard-nosed for as long, the people were willing to put up with them a bit longer. And it took another 9-10 months before Hungary's communist government fell and a democratic government was elected. The one exception was Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, a brutal dictator, had fancied himself popular with the common man. One of the reasons why he thought that was that he had, for years, had workers bust in from factories and coal mines and the like by the hundreds of thousands to stand in this vast square and listen to his long, boring speeches extolling his greatness along with the greatness of communism. He would go on for hours to them, and they would chant rhythmically at the right places. He apparently actually fancied that he was in truth popular with the people. But one day in December 1989, a crowd began taunting him with chants. And pretty soon the whole crowd of coal miners had picked up these chants. 200,000 people shouting insults, very rude words to Ceausescu. And you can see the video of him. He looks confused, like, what's going on? That's not the chants they're supposed to be doing, and now they're insulting me. And everybody around him was like, I don't know. Well, there was a relatively small number of troops there, but it was a huge crowd. And the troops were not willing to shoot the people or anything. So Ceausescu goes inside, but then the crowd surged forward in the palace, and it was all Ceausescu could do to escape with his life. Units of the army quickly declared themselves backing the people in revolt against Ceausescu. But unfortunately, other units of the army stayed loyal to Ceausescu. And they actually had about a 3-week-long, extremely bloody civil war, bombing, artillery fire in major cities, many tens of thousands killed, many, many more hurt. Eventually, Ceausescu was captured, he and his wife. They were hurriedly put on trial, live on CNN all over the world, by the way. And after about a 15-minute trial for crimes against the Romanian people, They were taken outside, lined up against a wall, and shot with machine gun fire. Hardly a proper trial, but he was dead, and pretty soon the units that had backed him gave up. And soon afterwards, Romania had democratic elections, and they are today a democratic country and actually one of America's staunchest allies in the world. They tend to vote with the United States almost more than any other country. The three countries that vote with us more than Romania in the UN are Israel, Britain, and Poland. They really turned. You'll notice the date they have here. They do mention the fall of the Berlin Wall in November, but here in East Germany, they have the date March of 1990. That is when the 5 states that made up the German Democratic Republic, the communist East Germany, voted to unite to West Germany, to the Federal Republic of Germany. It would be very much like if the provinces of Canada voted to become states of the United States. The Federal Republic simply expanded to the Northeast by 5 states in March of 1990, reuniting Germany, which frankly people of my generation and older never dreamed we'd see. This whole business was just too bizarre and remarkable for words. But all that happened in George H.W. Bush's first term. So now I'm going to turn the page in this book a couple of pages and remind you of the fall of the Soviet Union. No, we'll wait. Okay. Anyway, this is a map of Europe after the fall of communism. And you can see there the reunited Germany with its capital in Berlin, no longer divided. You can see the Czech Republic split. About a year after the Velvet Revolution, the Slovaks declared their independence from the Czech Republic. They felt like they weren't getting their fair share, that the Czechs were hoarding the prosperity of the newly independent Czechoslovakia. So they had a divorce. The Czech lands and the Slovak lands are no longer Czechoslovakia, but now 2 separate countries. You can see there Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The borders did not change. This reflects over here the fall of the Soviet Union, the new independence of Lithuania, Latvia. Up above it, you can't see on the map Estonia, but Belarus, Ukraine. Moldova is a Romanian-speaking region that Stalin, at the end of World War II in 1945, ripped away from Romania and made part of the Soviet Union. But it's an independent country today, in quotes. There are actually Russian troops all over the place to guarantee that it doesn't reunite with Romania like it would want to. And then we'll talk in the next lecture about the collapse of Yugoslavia. This was Yugoslavia, but it fell apart in 1990 and 1991 into a chaos. So I'll march you through that material in the next lecture. Thank you very much.